Yaritza, you're doing a lot of work with project-based learning, PBL. What's the primary message of your PBL coaching?
It has to remain student-centered. A lot of my work, when I was in a classroom, I taught overage undercredited students. These were students who experienced failure back to back to back. The question that I would always ask is why? I
Hmm.
never place blame on the students. I would never say, hey, it's because of reader comprehension, it's because of your test scores. I would always say, why? To fail twice and then eventually get it right is okay. Maybe you learned from that second failure. But to do so and spend 8 years in high school when it should only take 4, the question is, where we as the educators are going wrong. I knew to look at the curricula. I looked at pedagogy. I looked at what were students exposed to before? What were the experiences like? I had the kind of students who I would always say, they didn't hold back. When you asked them information, they would tell you everything down to the teacher's first and last name if they had kids. Like that's our kids. When they love you, they'll tell you everything.
It's at New
And
York.
yeah, it's New York.
Hmm.
Listen, I'm gonna tell you why I failed, right? That's how the kids. And there was one thing that had always come up, and it was, Miss, I don't understand it. And I would say, you don't understand history? And they're like, I don't understand none of it. And I would say, that's weird because with history, you want to feel a part of it. You want someone to be able to say, hey, around this era, this is what women were doing, or this is what African Americans were doing, this is what Latinos were doing. There's always should be that connection of during history, this is what a specific group of people were doing at this time. How does that impact life today? And so you
Hmm.
always make that connection. My students, they weren't able to because no one exposed them to what people who look like them and people who have the same cultural backgrounds as them were doing during those eras. And so I knew to change what I was doing, but also in a way where it was engaging. My students were at the center. They were at the heart of every single project, whether if it was us selling cars during the 1920s and me asking them to think about what Henry Ford might have thought about with the process. And my students would we would code Legos cars, and they would then have to become car salesmen. So you're doing your history, you're doing your research, you're trying to figure out why Henry Ford created this cheap, affordable car, at whose expense, who was working in these factories, how were African Americans being treated, how were the Irish being treated. And then when we're having these conversations, they're acting as salesmen or salespeople, and I'm asking specific questions tailored to the curriculum. They're having
Hmm.
fun with it. They think they're just selling me their Lego car. And for me, it's I need to know if you understand its historical significance, and then we're going to tie it into interchangeable car parts and what other things today is used during that assembly line. And I learned from my students the importance of PBL. And now that I'm an instructional coach or educational coach, I start with that first question. How are students at the center of this? So if you created this project, you as a teacher, and you did not think about students at all, that is not PBL. For me, that is just a regular project. But if your students are at the heart of it from the start to finish, you're thinking about those summative assessments. You're thinking about how we're going to get to the end. You're thinking about what questions we need to ask, what resources each individual student is going to need in order to complete this. To me, that's PBL.
Mm, 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 mm. Project management, action planning, systems, frameworks, tools, resources. Oh, students at the center.
Yeah,
Wow. So often overlooked, but so important, especially for babies who don't have knowledge of self.
right,
They don't have knowledge of self by design. By
right.
design.
Thank you for listening to the Lifelong Learning Defined podcast with Jorge Valenzuela.